Hello, I'd like to greet you at this one of our book discussions that are held by the Petroyaczyk Center for Ukrainian Historical Research and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press. We have initiated these in this time of COVID as a way of keeping communication and information and as well as hearing the voices of our readers and those involved with our scholarly activities. Today's event is an unusual one in that it is in many ways a celebration. It is a celebration of the appearance of volume 2 of Hrushevsky's History of Ukraine-Rus, but as well a celebration of the completion of the English translation of the Hrushevsky translation project with which we have long been involved. So in that sense, we are at a completion, but we don't view this as the end. We view this in many ways as the beginning in a number of ways in which we will be holding events for scholarly discussion and for celebration of various components of the Hrushevsky project. And through these, we will be mentioning the many translators, editors, scholars, bibliographers, and donors who have allowed us to complete this project or who have been our partners in completing this project. So we hope in this year to be with you, as well as putting on the entire history of Ukraine-Rus online so that it will be internationally available. I said today was a bit unusual. Obviously, planning in COVID is difficult, and we were a bit unsure as to when we would be able to have in-person launches. So we will be having more traditional launches as well for volume 2. What we decided at this point that it would be advisable to have a general discussion among scholars of the first cycle of Hrushevsky's books, that is volumes 1 through 3, and bring together some who have worked on the project, some who are now going to be using these volumes, and to hear their voices, I think will be very important for understanding what the significance of the project is. Now, you will be able to take part in this through the Q&A function. And please, during our discussion at any point, add these, and these will be read at the end of our cycle of this event. So please, as soon as you have something you would like to add to our discussion, put this up. Now, I said this event is a celebration, but it also has an element of sadness in a way, in that there are two people missing from this celebration. One of them is Talia Zajac, who passed away in September of last year at the age of 103. She and her husband, Mykhailo were major patrons of Ukrainian scholarship, academia, well known to the community in Toronto. In fact, they were the sponsors of 2 of the Hrushevsky volumes, and this is the second one to appear. So she got to see the first one that they had sponsored some years ago, and in many ways, I believe she is still with us as we now inaugurate or launch the second of those volumes. She is well known to those who deal with Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, because the Kowalski program for Eastern Ukraine, the study of Eastern Ukraine, is one of the major programs of our center. But if you go down the list of our institute and many other Ukrainian institutions, you will find their names. And what I advise you to do is look on the CIUS website, and under news and notes, you will find a biography of Pani Daria, and I think will profit by knowing what a specific generation of Ukrainian patriots who believed in academia and culture accomplished, even through the difficult times of their emigration. I said two people are missing. The other person missing is Marta Skorupska. Marta Skorupski was a brilliant translator who translated from Ukrainian, Russian, and other languages. She herself had all the qualities of a scholar, and she was the translator of the first volume of Hrushevsky's History of Ukraine-Rus, which was the first volume to appear, and as well as the translator of most of the text of volume 5. Her passing away is a great loss to Ukrainian academia and scholarship. And as well, by looking at our CIUS website, you will have a notice of some of the many accomplishments of Marta Skorupska. Now, at this point, I'd also like to mention a number of what I would call the stalwarts of this project that have allowed us to reach this point. Above all, Mr. Petroyaczyk, or Dr. Petroyaczyk, an honorary doctor of the University of Alberta, who would be 100 years old this year. So this is the centennial of his birth, who was a major patron and philanthropist, above all for academic projects, and a great believer that Hrushevsky's text should be translated into English, and a propagator of this idea among many others, that they should support this project as well, and of the Petroyaczyk Education Foundation, now headed by his daughter Nadia, which has always stood to help us in every ways in accomplishing this project. This project could have never been completed without the wonderful work of our managing editor, Ulyana Pasichnik. Ulyana Pasichnik, who from the first volume took over as managing editor and brought order to the project, and particularly order to the editor-in-chief, who set down many of the editorial policies for this project, and who has seen it through with us to this completion. And we are very grateful for all of her work. We are also grateful to, each volume had a managing editor, Miroslav Yurkevich, who was with our institute for many years, was the managing editor of a number of our volumes. His excellent work and his fine knowledge of, I would hesitate to say how many languages, stood this project in good stead. We are also grateful to the deputy editor of the project and that former associate director of the Zajac Center, Professor Tania Plawuszczak-Stech, who is now the Hrushevsky professor at Harvard University, and who worked particularly on the Cossack volumes, and we will be returning to those volumes in some of our later academic and community discussions. And we are also grateful to a number of our colleagues in Ukraine, many I would say at this point, a few I will mention as I mentioned the volumes now, but in particular Miron Kapral and his group at the Institute of Archaeography in Lviv, who have been of such tremendous service in doing the bibliographies for these projects, as well as Yaroslav Fedoruk, who worked with us from that institute as well from Kyiv. Now, as to these volumes, as I said, there are so many people who help this project that each launch will have new people. And as you read our editorial prefaces, you will see the long list. But just to shortly introduce the 3 volumes. The first of the volumes, as I said, was translated by Marta Skorupska. Ulyana Pasichnik served as the managing editor for this volume. Professor Andrzej Pope of Warsaw was the consulting editor of this volume, a scholar of wonderful reputation, who set this project, and particularly our study of Rus, I think, on a very good path. Without his help at that point, it would have been hard to imagine how we could have begun such a project. I might add, when we first thought of this, we didn't know that Ukraine would also open up. I might say that this lovely volume that you see, it was the product of our Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies Press, at that time directed by Professor Maxim Tarnowski. And he set this high standard for the artistic production of our volumes. And the sponsors for this volume were Petroy and Ivana Stelmach, to whom we are very grateful. Then, a number of years later, volume 3, the third of the cycle, came out for our project. Bogdan Struminsky, a well-known linguist, was the translator of this volume. He was a translator who was not a native English speaker, but he made up for that much more by his knowledge of so many languages and texts and solving so many difficult linguistic problems. Uliana Pasichnik was the managing editor, but here the number of our consulting editors grew very much. Yaroslav Fedoruk from Ukraine served on it, as did Robert Romanchuk from Florida. And that combination showed what an international project we had become. Introductions were written by Volodymyr Alexandrovich from Lviv and Svitlana Pankova from the Hrushevsky Museum in Kyiv. This volume was sponsored by the Shevchenko Society in the US. It was also supported by the legacy of the Brodatsky estate in London and by the Buduchny's Foundation here in Toronto. And now we come to the volume that has completed the cycle. Volume 2 was translated by Ian Press, a well-known linguist and translator from Great Britain or from Scotland. The consulting editor is with us today, Chris Raffensperger, and the introduction to this volume was written by Paul Hollingsworth, another member of our group today. As I said earlier, it was Mykhailo and Daria Kowalski who were sponsors of this volume, as well as funding was provided from the Brodatsky estate for the volume. And it was joined by a major donation from the Temerte Foundation. This is the second volume that they have supported. The goal of this support was to not only get the printed volume out, but to assist in dissemination of information on the entire project and to make sure that the project gets up online, and we will be fulfilling that, and we are grateful to them. The managing editor of this volume was Tania Stech. Tania Plawuszczak-Stech is a senior scholarly editor at CIUS. She's managing editor of this volume. She works as an editor and translator on the Internet Encyclopedia of Ukraine and is book review editor of East-West, the Journal of Ukrainian Studies. She's also well known to those of you who watch Kontakt and some of the TV programs. And now I would like to ask Tania to introduce our three discussants before I begin a discussion and questioning with them.
Thank you very much, Frank. Can everybody hear me now? Good. I'm very happy to see you. I'm very happy to have everybody here in attendance. Our esteemed panel of specialists today, at the very least, are distinguished from the rest of us mere mortals by their reading knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Church Slavonic. On volume 2, our Mr. Sunshine was Chris Raffensperger, Professor Chris Raffensperger. He's a professor and chair of history at Wittenberg University. He's a director of its pre-modern and ancient world studies program, and he's an associate of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. He has published several books dealing with the history of Kyivan Rus and medieval Eastern Europe, and he will contextualize those books for you himself within the framework of our discussion. His studies present the Rus state as one of the realms of medieval Europe, which is important for our understanding and placement of Ukraine today. He has also done groundbreaking research into the dynastic ties of the Rus princely families. And there is a related digital project that I hope to hear more about today too. He was the consulting editor, as Frank mentioned, on volume 2, the translation of volume 2 of Hrushevsky's history. And especially he wrote the bibliographic updates to Hrushevsky's notes. And I look forward to hearing more about his additional research into the bibliographies regarding Rus. Moving along, on volume 2, Mr. Zest for Life was Dr. Paul Hollingsworth. Dr. Paul Hollingsworth is a Byzantine and Kyivan Rus specialist. He's a translator and author of the introduction to the hagiography of Kyivan Rus, which came out in the series of Harvard Library of Early Ukrainian Literature in 1992. He is the author, as I believe we know, but I will mention it again. He's the author of the introduction to volume 2 of Hrushevsky's history, in which he comprehensively assesses the enduring contribution to and the transformational role of volume 2 in modern scholarship and about medieval Rus. In the process of his assessment, he details Hrushevsky's deconstruction of the Russian imperial narrative regarding Kyivan Rus in Ukraine, which again is important for our comprehension and contextualization of modern day intellectual trends and currents in scholarship on and information sharing about Ukraine. So why is Paul's view of things particularly noteworthy? Because he himself witnessed the genesis of the scholarly resurrection of Hrushevsky's approach to the study of Ukraine and the seismic shift in the nomenclature that occurred in Ukrainian and Rus studies at the time. And I do hope, Paul, that you will tell your story today. Presently, Paul is preparing an English language translation of the Kyiv Chronicle for the Harvard Library of Early Ukrainian Literature. And I hope to hear about that too. Moving along now to a person who I've corresponded with, but I'm meeting here for the first time today, Dr. Talia Zajac. She's not directly related to the Hrushevsky translation project, so she's our external examiner of sorts today. She is a medieval studies specialist who has garnered numerous awards and has published some important work, which she will describe to us further today. She is currently the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library at Manchester University. She is working on a fascinating research project. It's titled Royal Women, Cultural Exchanges and Rus Ecumenical Marriages circa 1000 to 1250. And I can't wait to hear more about that. It's just an underrepresented topic. The project studies the political patronage and diplomatic roles of brides from Kyivan Rus in Western Europe. So I know that here in the diaspora, we're interested very much in this type of connections, this type of history. So she holds a PhD from the University of Toronto. She has previously taught at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, the University of Nottingham, and the University of Manchester. In addition to her academic interests, Talia engages in creative writing about the past. And there's a very interesting fact for us in the diaspora. I'm sure that people remember her libretto for the oratorio Golden Harvest, which was set to music by the composer Larissa Kuzmenko to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the settlement of Ukrainian Canadians, was premiered by the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra in March 2016. I remember that well. It was a wonderful, wonderful event and garnered great reviews. So I really look forward to hearing more about your work and interest, Talia. And last but not least, a man who needs very little introduction, Professor Frank E. Sysyn. He's the director of the Peter Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He's professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. And he is a specialist in Ukrainian and Polish history and the author of several books and countless studies. And he serves as editor-in-chief of the Hrushevsky translation project. He mentioned himself sort of in passing. There's much more I could say, of course, about Frank, but he has asked me to please err on the side of modesty, which I am doing. And so with that, I move it along again and we move it to Frank.
Yeah, and I think we've already begun our first question. That is, all of you have research interests, are carrying on this research at a time well over 100 years since Hrushevsky wrote. And I think a major question would be, what does Hrushevsky's work mean for you in your research? To what degree do you find something in Hrushevsky that is useful, even if it is something in which you are going to argue against it? And how would you answer if someone asks you, where does Hrushevsky stand in what you see as your area of expertise? So I open it up to the three of you and encourage you to interrupt each other if you want to add something in the discussion so we have more of a discussion.
I'm happy to start with this, but Paul's introduction to the volume lays this out so very nicely, how important it is. But going through and reading this, chapter by chapter or section by section, as Tania sent them to me, I kept thinking, if this had been published in English, 100 years ago when he wrote it, I wouldn't have to write my work. I mean, that's what I kept thinking is like what Talia and I do in particular is we try and connect Kyiv and Kyivan Rus with the rest of medieval Europe. And Hrushevsky did it. I mean, he did it 100 years ago. And when I kept reading this and I read, volume 3 as well, it's all there. All of that stuff is there. And so he really laid the foundations for work that was seminal in creating a larger medieval Europe that was inclusive of Rus. And that's something that is largely unknown outside of Ukraine and outside of the diaspora. And so the translations into English are hugely important for just demonstrating that there's a base for the scholarship, for the things that, that not just Talia and I, but many of us are doing these days in trying to bring Rus into Europe.
Yeah, I don't know, Paul, if you want to intervene, but I'll just quickly say that I completely agree that this is a monumental work of scholarship, and having it in English, it's surprising rereading it just how fresh Hrushevsky is. In fact, it's aged tremendously well. If you consider other scholarship, for example, by German scholars on ethnogenesis around the same time as Hrushevsky was writing, those ideas have been categorically rejected by scholarship, have been completely, found to be anachronistic. But the cautious approach and the breadth and the depth that Hrushevsky brought to all of his many sources, working across multiple languages, working across multiple media, it actually reads very, very freshly as a work of monumental scholarship, but one that very much, I think, speaks to contemporary interests and trends. And another thing I think that struck me while rereading the Old Rus cycle for this discussion is the interdisciplinarity of Hrushevsky, how he was engaging with archaeology, with material objects, with different types of sources. This is something that in medieval studies sort of only became a trend, from the 1950s, 1960s with the Annales school in France, and continues to be sort of now the dominant mode of approaching the medieval period, looking at evidence from these various scholarly disciplines. But Hrushevsky was already doing that at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I think having this in English, which is now really a world language of scholarship, will make Hrushevsky much more accessible, and in fact, in many days, validate some of his findings, I think, bringing it in again to contemporary conversation and bringing to light things that have in many ways been there all along.
Yeah, for me, Frank, I think the two things to consider and answer your question is, one, there haven't been a lot of new sources found for medieval East Slavic history. A lot of new evidence has been found through archaeology, but Hrushevsky had a complete command of the literary evidence. So number one is, he was dealing with all the facts as certainly as they were known at the time. Second, he was intellectually honest. He didn't put his thumb on the scale for arguments. He was rigorous in analyzing the sources. He was trying to tell a story as the sources told the story, or at least as he teased the story out of the sources. So when I look at him in the context of my research today, what you're seeing actually is I'm experiencing what people are experiencing in Ukraine and Russia and Belarus today. They're finally actually reading and citing Hrushevsky because he laid these arguments down. He laid these narratives down 120 years ago in a way that was novel at the time, comprehensive to the ultimate degree, and intellectually rigorous. And as a result, he's foundational in an enormous number of aspects of studying pre-Mongol Rus history.
Well, and I would just add to that, again, I think following the inspiration of Paul's introduction, I went and read some of the contemporary medieval history that was coming out at the beginning of the 20th century. And the place where you can actually see Hrushevsky's influence is from his volume 1, which was translated into German. It's the only one of the volumes that was translated into another language from our cycle. And so it was translated into German, and you can see in the first edition of the Cambridge Medieval History, which is, the massive tome that is going to define medieval European history, that even though J.B. Bury, set up Rus as part of the Byzantine world, Hrushevsky is actually cited. Hrushevsky is dealt with in historiography there, talking about the ethnogenesis, as Talia was saying, of Rus. But it stops with Volodymyr Sviatoslavich, right? It absolutely stops as soon as that Hrushevsky volume stops. It convinced me reading that, and I ended up writing a piece on this for Harvard Ukrainian Studies, that if Hrushevsky had been translated at that time, right, that might have shaped the way the 20th century studied medieval Europe, with Rus being included in it. And in English, as again Talia noted, is become a world scholarly language, but German would have done it 100 years ago too. So I'm so glad that this is happening, and I think it's going to inspire not just more historical studies, but more historiographical studies to understand what was known, when, and why.
And it seems that Hrushevsky himself was aware of this impetus, both to write in Ukrainian and that as an important statement, but also to have his work be as disseminated as widely as possible. And I think some of the introductory essays, if I recall, discuss his correspondence with contemporary scholars and trying to get his work out with the sort of censorship and with all of the sort of limitations that he had in order to reach this broader scholarly audience. So I think in a way the English translation is the completion of this process of dissemination that we finally see now will enter the historiography.
And I think Chris makes a great point, because it's really hard for us to convey to non-scholars who don't work in the field the degree to which sort of the historiographical VCR, the pause button was hit, with the Bolshevik Revolution, and the pause button only has come off in the 1990s and since. And so we're seeing an explosion of scholarship in Russian, Belarusian, and Ukrainian scholars, which strikes us as revisionist. But as Chris points out, it's not revisionist if you realize that Hrushevsky was saying many of these things, or his contemporaries were saying them 120 years ago. So what's seeing as novel now, sort of an ad fontes, go back to the sources approach throughout the field, where a lot of sort of old idols are being smashed because they turn out to have feet of clay. That is, Chris says, you can imagine an alternate universe in which the Bolshevik Revolution had not happened, and Ukrainian would have been required reading for anybody wanting to learn about Ukrainian history, as opposed to people writing Ukrainian history for centuries or for decades without citing Hrushevsky or reading him.
I think that for many of us who've been around writing about Ukraine for quite a time, what we've often found out is that books that we wrote, or the articles that we wrote 30 or 40 years ago, are now paid somewhat attention to because Ukraine is independent. Those were items written in English, so there was no language barrier, but there was a thought barrier. So on the one hand, you have the Rus field is, as we know from something that Chris has just written, is really in quite good shape in English language scholarship at the moment. I'm not already talking about German and, of course, what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, and other places. If you looked at your colleagues in the field, how many of them do you think pay attention to Hrushevsky? And how many of them in particular tend to avoid him because he has viewed as a Ukrainian nationalist, and therefore should I really weigh through this? So do you have any feeling on that? I realize you have no surveys you can tell me on it.
I'll just jump in and say, Frank, I don't think people have avoided him, at least not in British or American scholarship for any of those reasons. I think they just haven't known of him.
Yeah.
I mean, it was entirely possible to become a medievalist on Rus studies and never read anything by Hrushevsky. I make this point in my introduction. You can go back and look at a lot of the standard histories that we all grew up with, and there's no mention of Hrushevsky, with the exception of Vernadsky, who knew him and cited him. He was for the most part ignored in scholarship. And so I think that one of the great contributions this project is making is it will introduce Hrushevsky to British and American scholars that may not know Ukrainian or may never learn Ukrainian, but they'll be able to read the work of the greatest Ukrainian historian. And by the way, one of the greatest historians of all time.
Yeah, I agree. I agree in terms of breadth and depth and sheer monumentality. And I agree also with Paul's comment, just that in terms of kind of wide surveys of the medieval world, Rus, as Christian, I think will agree, is not always included. And when it is included, there tends to be more of a focus again on this sort of narrative geared more towards Muscovy. And so Hrushevsky is not always cited, but I think that is changing.
And I think that, Paul's point is certainly spot on. It's not an ignoring, it's not a dismissal, right? I remember after Frank asked me to participate on this project, I was talking to somebody who is not associated with the project and mentioned it. And that person said to me, well, Hrushevsky is already readable for everybody who wants to read it. And I just don't think that's true. I really think, in fact, that there are a lot of people who probably want to read it, even if they don't know about it. And so this is going to make it accessible all over the place. And so, there are so few graduate programs that are turning out students who work on this period. But Hrushevsky is going to be, on the required reading list now for fields in early Rus for all kinds of people, whereas before it wouldn't have been.
Yeah.
I think in many ways that I'm going to presume something, which is that Talia is of Ukrainian background, and therefore Hrushevsky and the name was around the house and somewhat indoctrinated.
And volume one.
Yeah, so that her reaching Hrushevsky as a scholar perhaps comes from a different beginning point than for Chris and Paul. So I wonder, we have, and I think we can still sell the book if we let Paul say a little bit more about his introduction. But what I'd like maybe for, well, one, Talia, perhaps say, did he live up to your expectations as sold to you by your community and world around you? But also to ask Chris and Paul, when they first encounter Hrushevsky, and also how does their conceptualization of Rus and the Rus period change over their own development?
Well, I'll just say really quickly, I certainly think Hrushevsky, there are very few people that I would call a genius, but I think he certainly was a genius in terms of, it's difficult to sum up the amount of subjects he covered: art history, architecture, political history, family life, art, geography and what we would now call environmental history, but with very careful attention to sources. And many of his, at a time when the historiography was still fairly young, assessments, for example, on the authenticity of the so-called shapka monomacha, or monarch's cap, that this might not be an authentic object. Many of his thoughts have been proven to be absolutely true by subsequent scholars. So yes, this is without question, I think, one of the great histories of the early 20th century, of the long 19th century, in any field, I would say. One of these major historiographical works that rereading, I'll say again, the freshness of it and the accuracy of the scholarly assessment certainly stands up very well 100 years on.
Well, Frank, I think, as you know, maybe I don't want to give any spoiler alerts and people won't buy the book, but if I give spoiler alerts about the introduction, a third of it is based on my own personal story, because I actually can say with actual genuineness, Hrushevsky changed my life. As did Frank Sysyn, by the way, but I'll just deal with Hrushevsky. Because I fell in love with medieval Russia as a student at Georgetown in the early 1970s through a couple of really eccentric Jesuits. And so I decided I wanted to become a medievalist, do Byzantine and medieval Slavic studies. And so when I started, went to UC Berkeley to do this program, I was really interested in medieval Russia. And then in 1983, I met Ihor Shevchenko at Dunbar and Oaks. And those of you who know Ihor Shevchenko, who is to say larger than life force is an understatement. He challenged me immediately on my conceptualization of medieval Russia. And 2 years later, I found myself at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute with Shevchenko and Pritsak and Frank and that incredible world there with Ned Keenan and many others who were not Ukrainians or were in this world, but came at Ukrainian studies a whole different way. And I read Hrushevsky, and the minute I did, it was, sort of the scales fell from my eyes. I could no longer go with the paradigm I had been taught, that this period was sort of the precursor, the foundational period for Russian history. Rather, it was a period in and of itself that needed to be studied in and of itself, which of course was the goal of my dissertation supervisor, Peter Brown, who studied late antique history in and of itself, and not simply as the end of the Roman Empire or the beginning of the medieval world, but as a world in and of itself. And so, through reading Hrushevsky in 1985 and 86, and then discussing Ukrainian studies with the incredibly rich intellectual life at Harvard at the time, I couldn't ever go back. And I tell the story in the book that my coming of sort of age at that time coincided with sort of the victory of the Hrushevsky paradigm, right? The final overturning of the Russian imperial historiographical narrative that said that all of this time before the 16th century was just a prelude to getting on to what really mattered, which was Muscovy and the Russian Empire. And so in that sense, Frank, I think, as you know, because we talked for many times over the years, this was a pivotal moment in my life. And I still remember to this day reading Hrushevsky, first in English, and then having to learn Ukrainian, which I did at Harvard, to be able to read it in the original, so I could read all the volumes. And to this day, I'm deeply grateful, which is why I loved this. Helping this project was a labor of love, because it's a give back for what Hrushevsky and the Harvard program gave to me.
Well, my story is real similar to Paul's in that I got into this as a joining of my medieval interest and my Russian interest. My Russian interest was modern language, which I happened to learn in high school during the fall of the Soviet Union. And then I'd always been interested in medieval things, and the Vikings put them together for me when I was in college. And so I came at it from a perspective of getting into Rus through medieval Europe already. But, and my introduction to Hrushevsky came just like Paul at Fury when I was on sabbatical there about 7 years ago. And it was a great experience, but I would actually like to shift just a little bit and comment too on what else Paul was saying, which is that I don't think that the Hrushevsky paradigm has won. In fact, I think it's still really marginal, and that our field is incredibly dominated by the Muscovite paradigm. And so there are subfields, of course. And so you've got our Ukrainian studies, you've got the Ukrainian diaspora community. But if you go to ACES, and I've largely stopped going to ACES because the majority of early Slavic panels are all Muscovite. And, when I used to go and present with Francis Butler, who some of you know, Francis and I would always say, well, we can only do a panel together if we also get a Muscovite person. Otherwise, no one's going to come and listen to us. And that's really the case. And in fact, the place I really go now is I go to Byzantine studies and medieval studies conferences to talk about Rus and to bring Rus into those worlds, because the ACES conference seems so much more about creating this path towards modern Russia, at least in my experience in the early Slavic sphere. But even beyond.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I would agree. I would just say that I wonder if part of the dynamic at play here that Professor Raffensperger is describing is partly because of teaching models, that there is a specialist discussion on Rus as part of the medieval world, and a specialist discussion of Rus seen as Paul said, sort of in and of itself as a medieval polity. But the way that departments are often organized is that many universities do have a Russian studies program, at least as a minor, in which if Rus is mentioned at all, it's a few weeks at the beginning of the term before talking about Peter the Great and so forth. Perhaps not even much time spent on Muscovy either. And so the way that courses and syllabi are structured, and therefore also buying for academic libraries for undergraduate teachings primarily, I do agree with Professor Raffensperger that there's a challenge there in terms of not only showing one-sided teleological view of the past, but I wonder if some of this dynamic is this dichotomy between a specialist conversation and teaching dynamic that is still largely, at least in North America, focused on Russian studies.
Well, and I'll put my hand up to teaching a class on Russian history. I mean, I teach a 3-course cycle on Russian history because we have, as Talia says, a Russian studies program, and it needs to fit into that rubric to get approval. And so I have a class on medieval Russia in which I don't ever talk about Russia. But I have to list it as that. And, I used to give Janet Martin a hard time for writing a book about medieval Russia. But, once you open the cover of that book, then you find it's actually about Rus until it's about Muscovy, right? So there are these things, these silos that Talia is talking about that we do have to live in. But beyond that, there are still so many books that are coming out. There's a new one that just came out pretty recently about Russia's empires, where Rus is just like the ill-formed bastard child that doesn't quite make it up to the standard of Russia. And then you get into these other surveys where Rus, as Talia mentions, is just the precursor. Like, what leads into Muscovy? Where does Muscovy come from? Well, here it comes from Rus. And some of this is just deep inside of us. Don Ostrovsky and I are writing a book about the ruling families of Rus, and I have written things and sent them to him, and we're collaborating, and he writes back and he's like, no, like this is not the Hrushevsky way, right? This is the Russian way that you're expressing this. And I think, yeah, he's right. But it's just somehow it got in there, and through the path of picking this up as a Russian studies person, which is how I got into Rus through that back door.
Hey, Chris, I don't at all discount the challenges you face both pedagogically and from a scholarly perspective. But when I look at books like Chris Wickham's book on medieval Europe, Rus figures in there, like, as you argue, like any other European country, right? I mean, it's part of Europe. It's not. Okay. It's not some weird stepchild that's at Thanksgiving and at the card table in the kitchen with the crazy aunt. It's part of European society, part of European culture, going through the same challenges as well as booms and prosperity, et cetera, in the 12th or 13th centuries. So I think that from a scholarly perspective, I think that the field has made enormous progress in integrating Rus. Let's forget what happens after 1240. That period from sort of 8th through into the 13th century, integrating that into a European context, although seeing that Rus has also a Eurasian and northern and southern aspects, which differ from, let's say, medieval France. But I see Rus being treated now finally as an equal among European, centers of power.
Boy, I just don't. And I think I have a different perspective on Wickham, but he's certainly an outlier. I mean, Talia and I had a conversation about Robert Bartlett's new book, and it certainly is still in the old Bartlett mode of the making of Europe, in which the entirety of Eastern Europe is colonized by the Germanic peoples because they need order, right? I mean, it's actually a version of the Rurik legend writ large. Like, they can't rule themselves, so we need the Franks to come in and take charge.
Well, I don't know if I would go so far, but certainly I agree that Rus, as Paul has shown, as you've shown, there is a growing scholarship in English, and the attention to sources and treating the sources first, rather than imposing kind of a teleological framework, is emerging. But at the same time, I think there are structural problems with academic conferences, as you pointed out, with the presence of Rus as a whole in medieval studies, that it still, I think, will take some time to emerge more fully. Yeah.
Well, and I called on you for, I don't know.
Yeah. I was just going to say medievalists are resistant. I mean, I did a textbook review last year of about a dozen medieval Europe textbooks, and most of them have no mention of Rus apart from the Vikings found Rus and then it's converted by Byzantium. The best of them probably is Barbara Rosenwein's. But medievalists don't want to talk about that. I mean, I submitted something. So I wrote a piece about this and sent it into a journal. And the response from one of the readers was, no, Barbara Rosenwein's fixed this. We don't have this problem anymore. And it's like,
I called on you to have a discussion. I'm glad you did. We see there are differing viewpoints. They are also, in some ways, I would argue, generational, although I still view Paul Hollingsworth as a young scholar whom I met at a certain point. Time has gone on, and we have seen a different course of development than you are seeing and what we want you to see. And that's, I think, got to be our next step. The only comment I will make is that for those of us who dealt with the early modern period and created at Harvard, in Edmonton, and a number of other places, a whole school that worked on early modern Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, we found a whole world that I think has had considerable impact, certainly in Poland. And I'm now on a commission with the German Historical Institute in Moscow, and certainly their projects are very open to Ukrainian topics. One of the reasons we have had the relative success of late have been the flowering of early modern studies in Ukraine. The schools of Natalia Yakovenko, the legacies of Yaroslav Isayevich and Yaroslav Dashkevich, and I might add Yaroslav Isayevich was supposed to be our editor of volume 3 and regrettably passed away before this happened. So we have a fairly wide and broad world. My impression is, relatively speaking, there are still a paucity of scholars of Rus, not only in as many as we want in the West, but also in Ukraine of medieval Rus, compared to the number of scholars in Moscow and Petersburg. And this also may influence, therefore, scholars in the West and their contexts on this. But also we stayed away from political topics or direct political topics, but we're also back into a period where people are fighting for the legacy. That is, do you see this as impacting the field? Do Putin's statue for him, Vladimir, make a difference in the way colleagues in Russia are willing to look at the field, or colleagues in Ukraine are looking at the field?
I think it's a tough question. I would say that people have been personally very cordial to me and very willing to share material, but I think there is a certain amount of delicacy on these political questions. At the same time, I think in terms of representing the Ukrainian point of view, having something like Hrushevsky's history is enormously important as a scholarly foundation for questions of heritage, for example, for his discussion of Halachna, Galicia, and its context with the West, and the sort of cultural exchanges with Hungary and with Poland that I'm very interested in, that are quite unique, and that sort of a school of historiography that focuses on the Russian Empire doesn't traditionally take into account. And for this reason, I think it's quite important that this translation has come out. One of the many reasons, partly to have that scholarly foundation with which to have these discussions that can indeed become politicized.
I might add, I was in Poland recently, and it suddenly dawned on me that young Poles will only read Hrushevsky in English. They'll never read it in Ukrainian. For some reason, that had never penetrated to me before. Slavic language were a field, but if they're going to read anything of Hrushevsky, it's going to be in English today, because that's the language. Ukraine, they don't know Cyrillic letters anymore. Their students on that. But with that, if you could just, before we open up to a more general discussion, I wondered if you'd comment. We have done a lot of editorial work. That is. Bibliographies, footnotes, introductions. At times, we have even had to deal, or we deal with the issue, what happens when modern scholarship doesn't agree with Hrushevsky, or some modern scholars don't. So how do you feel the volumes contribute that way? Do you see these as positives for it? And you can comment even negatively about our editorial practices. At this point, they'll stand as we've done them until now. You were, of course, in 2 cases, were involved with them.
I really I thought it was good, and I especially have to single out Tania for being so patient with me, because I would put comments in and say, I don't think this is right, and she would write back and be like, well, do you want to put an editor's note in, or you just don't think it's right? And I'm like, okay, yeah, all right. I have to actually choose something here and follow it along. But it was the process was very open to editorial notes that were correcting errors of fact, right? But we kept the opinion of Hrushevsky, which is going to allow the historiography and historiographical writings to proceed much better. But also, doing it was so fascinating, because it seems, and Tania gave us props for our languages, and Paul has already said that Hrushevsky knew all the languages. I think he'd actually internalized so much of the chronicle histories that he would just free associate quotations that were really paraphrases. And so I was going crazy trying to find where these things were actually from sometimes, because they weren't actual quotations. They were kind of quotations, right? He was summarizing bits and pieces. And so, I would search and find these things, then Tania would go find some of these things. And I think all of that work will really benefit the readers of this volume, because then they will be able to see exactly where he's getting his information, how he's drawing his inferences, what chronicle variant he was using, because he used some of the different Hypatian versions than we often use today from the PSRL. So I think all of that editorial work is going to be so useful to readers.
Yeah, I don't think a reader of the volume as it stands now can understand how Herculean the labor has been to edit this volume, for which Tania deserves the lion's share of the credit, along with others, because Hrushevsky wanted the sources to tell the story. So the volume is full of quotes in the original, and then as Chris points out, with Hrushevsky's modern Ukrainian paraphrase, or something in between the original source and modern Ukrainian. And so trying to understand and untangle all that and be faithful to Hrushevsky while still letting the reader have access to what he's trying to say, that is what his point is in adducing that evidence, I think they've been wildly successful, frankly. I think the volume reads really, really well. I think that the volume itself is a contribution to scholarship, not just the Hrushevsky content.
I remember, Paul, once we sprained your brain because we gave you such a question about untangling a meaning of a particular passage. I felt really bad about that. You had to take an Advil.
Yeah, we had, I mean, a lot of challenges with it because often you want to reach for a medieval word to translate something, but that word may mean something to medievalists who studied France. As opposed to, this is something Chris points out constantly in objecting to the use of the word prince for knyaz, because that word is king every place else in Europe other than Rus, and that grows out of a historiographical tradition. It's too complicated to explain here, but those are the kind of thorny things we had to, and I apologize, Tania, for torturing you on the word for castle, whether Zamak should be translated as castle or citadel. We fought about that for months.
Yeah, no, actually, it was a very productive discussion. I'm very happy about it.
But frankly, to your point, the editorial standards of all of the volumes has been exceptionally high, and this volume meets all the standards of the previous publications.
Yeah, we have been grateful and fortunate that we were able to assemble international teams. We also benefited from the communication revolution, which has made it, first of all, we benefited from the breakup of the Soviet Union. Then we benefited from the communication changes, which have made it possible for you to get an answer in minutes from colleagues who are thousands and thousands of miles away. And then we also benefited as more and more of our colleagues in Ukraine learned at least forms of English. Now, what I think is important for pointing out to our general public, we are making decisions all the time by giving this translation. Once the Ukrainian humor journal, Lis Mikita, which was once a very popular journal in our diaspora, said, I don't understand it. First, they have someone translate it. Then they have someone edit the translation. And then they have someone edit the editor. Didn't the first translator know what they were translating? What you had to point out was that each term is never an exact translation. We were trying to set up the terminology for this period. And I think very important as well for the glossaries of our various volumes are worth going through, and the early modern ones become even more complex as the documents do. So we are grateful to all you and all those scholars who helped, all our colleagues in Ukraine. What I'll point out, I mentioned Professor Andrzej Poppe in Volume 1. Volume 1 had 1,700 bibliographic items used by Hrushevsky. When we first started the project, I could not imagine. And I might add, there are no bibliographies in full to the Hrushevsky volumes in their original. And under the absolute determined leadership of Professor Andrzej Poppe, all of them but one or maybe two were found and seen de visu. They checked them. So that volume in itself, that bibliography, I think will stand for a long time. What I might add is our colleagues in Ukraine are now putting out Hrushevsky again. The problems have become linguistic, that is for the contemporary Ukrainian, and particularly Hrushevsky becomes harder and harder to read. This is a language that is not similar to contemporary Ukrainian, and particularly when you deal with historic periods where they have more and more problems. So the issue of what they are going to do, are they going to modernize the language, comes up. But they also are good colleagues who have so often helped us in doing our volumes, said they're just going to take our bibliographic and editorial work and use it for it. Now, we have hopes that they will get the funding to go into the 50 volume of Hrushevsky volumes that are going to be put out, and that we will see this. There already exists a Hrushevsky digital archive that our colleague Oksana Yurkova puts out in Kyiv, puts on online on Kyiv, in Kyiv, and which we help to get all kinds of material about Hrushevsky, the hundreds and if not thousands of hundreds of scholarly and thousands of works of Hrushevsky online. And of course, our English is going to be now computer searchable and online in the new version. And with that, what I would like to is, and while we have a considerable public which stayed with this group, as I can see from looking at participants, and I'm very pleased to see that an academic discussion can, on a medieval period, can draw such a group. But I think our press would like to make a little pitch for sales and a little description of volume 2, and then we open up to general questions. So please, Marko.
Thank you very much, Frank. It was a fascinating discussion. Thank you, all of you. I want to just first speak very briefly before we open up the questions. I first and foremost wanted to encourage you to ask questions, to write your questions. We have so far very few of them. There is a much potential now to get answers to your questions. But before we get to that, I just wanted to very briefly say that to all of you who were inspired by this discussion, the CIUS Press makes all 3 volumes for a very limited time 25% off. It is only available on our website this way. Not only is it the 25% off, but it is in Canadian dollars. So whoever orders from the States gets additional discount, or from Europe. I also wanted to say that for a very, very limited time, we will have the entire set also at 20% off for those of you who would like to buy the entire set. And still encouraging you to ask, to write your questions. I would like to ask Tania to say a little bit about the cover and the art for the cover of this particular volume 2. And those of you who know us, those of you who know our series, know that our covers are not only beautiful, but they have very big meaning. They are not accidental. And I wanted to ask Tania, who was not only working on every aspect of the text, but who selected this artwork and actually worked extremely precisely on color adjustment so that it looks exactly like so in the print. Tania, could you talk about this a bit?
Yes, actually, it's more of a casual discussion that I would actually hope will lead to either somebody passing forward some information, more information that would be of interest, or for some scholarly work to be done in the matter. The cover of our volume is the 11th century mosaic of an archangel from St. Sophia Cathedral in Kyiv. It is the only sort of originally intact archangel. The rest were painted in later by a painter named Vrubel. We don't know that this is St. Michael because the name inscription has disappeared. But by the way, I ran across a work of an esteemed Harvard professor named Ernest Kitzinger. And I'm sure that you know, because he also was at Dumbarton Oaks. He conducted a study of 12th century mosaics of Norman Sicily. And he started at Dumbarton Oaks, and he became the director of studies and professor of Byzantine art and archaeology. And as director of studies, he firmly established Dumbarton Oaks as an academic institution of international renown and the world's leading institution for Byzantine studies. And he wrote a very detailed, nearly 500-page book about the Church of St. Mary of the Admiral in Palermo, Sicily, Church of Santa Maria del Amaraglio. And the book is titled The Mosaics of St. Mary's of the Admiral in Palermo, and it was published by Dumbarton Oaks. And in St. Mary's, it was constructed in the 12th century. And as we know, St. Sophia was constructed in the 11th. Well, there are some debates about the exact time, but and it has a mosaic of the Archangel Michael, the St. Mary's Church in Sicily, and the name is inscribed. And I did read through Professor Kitzinger's descriptions.
It sounds like you can show the
yes,
the
if
other...
you could show the other, please. The other icon. Yes, see, this is the icon from St. Mary's Church in Sicily, and it is actually the church has been restored several times dramatically, but these mosaics are largely as they were originally, and it's so similar to the one in St. Sophia in Kyiv, and in fact, Professor Kitzinger does speak about the Kyiv St. Sophia Kyiv Archangel, but he doesn't go beyond description. He sort of says that these things exist, here they are, there, but he doesn't make sort of conclusions about it. And I'm just quite remarking on the similarity. We know that this one is St. Michael because it does have that inscription. It did remain through the centuries, and the robes and the loris and the robes are so similar. The look, and I'm wanting to believe that our nameless archangel on the cover is St. Michael. And it would be, I think Hrushevsky would be very happy to have St. Michael on the cover of this particular volume. In the times of Kyivan Rus, there was a legend that an angel is attached to every nation, and in the time of Kyivan Rus, that angel was Michael. And Michael has very significant symbolism even today. He is the patron saint of the Maidan. And taking into account what Hrushevsky was trying to do, how he was sort of stopped from being able to get his important point across, and how we are bringing it back, we're resurrecting a vision. That's why I thought it was important to have this icon on our cover. And I really hope that either I can get more information from the scholars who are specialists in the field, or that the field could move in that direction, and bring back a look at Professor Kitzinger's work.
Thank you very much, Tania. So I will start reading the questions. They're slowly accumulating, but I will start with a comment, not a question, but a comment from our U of A colleague, Oliver Rossier, who says, excellent discussion, opening new chapters of discussion, makes me want to go back to school and get into these classes. So you obviously were influential on it. There is one very simple question that I want to ask of you. Has Hrushevsky been translated into Russian? I personally don't know of the translation of the full history. Frank, you need to unmute your mic.
Yeah, there are parts of the early volumes and then parts of 7 and 8 that are available in Russian.
Okay.
But
There are two questions from
Mark.
Yes.
I think but I think it's important to understand Hrushevsky wrote a lot in Russian, particularly on the medieval period, while he was active as a scholar.
Yes,
so
of course.
His views are not unknown to Russian reading populations.
Of course.
If I can add something else on that, strangely enough, because of not strangely enough, because of the Soviet system, when Hrushevsky was easily available in the original in Moscow, it was hard to get to in Kyiv, and still harder to get to in the provinces. So interestingly enough, it was, for those who were going to read the Ukrainian, but most of it was in Ukrainian, it was easier for a Russian scholar than for a Ukrainian scholar to get to Hrushevsky through much of time.
Somewhat, another question somewhat in the same vein is, how long will it take for Hrushevsky to be absorbed and processed by the current generation of Russian and East European scholars, historians? I mean, of course, I believe that we are not talking about Ukrainian historians who know them, but can you say anything about Russian and Eastern European?
Well, Frank mentioned the generational approach earlier in Paul and my conversation. And I think that that seems to be the case. I mean, I gave a talk last week at Kyiv Mykhailo, and it was very interesting. It was graduate students almost entirely. And, they just buy into this idea. And Olenka Pevny was there, and she did in the introduction, and she was saying, the way change happens is not so much people's minds change, is that one generation dies out and then the next generation has new ideas. So I think it's actually going to be a while before ideas change and we see those effects.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of North America, I hope that libraries will buy the book and that it will get on reading lists, and that I think will make a big difference even within, for example, Russian studies context, where the structure of the course is focused towards later developments in the North. Having that on reading lists, I think, will make a difference in terms of Anglophone speakers and beyond Anglophone speakers, also others, as I think Professor Sysyn mentioned earlier, in Poland, for example, accessing this work in English in other countries as well.
Okay, I will continue somewhat in the same vein. There is a question for an anonymous attendee. Is there a danger of anti-Russian bias today, as there had been anti-Ukrainian bias in the past in the interpretation, translation of Hrushevsky and other Ukrainian historians? Do you have any comment to that?
Could you just repeat the question entirely?
Is there a danger of anti-Russian bias today, as there had been anti-Ukrainian bias in the past in their interpretation, translation of Hrushevsky and other Ukrainian historians? I guess this refers to the question that was brought up by Frank, whether Hrushevsky is being read or being ignored, perhaps because he is considered a nationalist.
I think I'm sure others want to comment, but I'll just quickly say, in terms of scale, I think is important to keep in mind that Russian studies is still an enormous field. And at least in any sort of mid-size or larger university, there is usually at least a Russian language department, sometimes also a few members of history faculty. So this is still, in some sense, I think, in terms of the structure of universities, for example, in the UK, to my knowledge, Cambridge University is the only Ukrainian studies program in the UK with Ukrainian studies per se, whereas almost every university has a Russian, at least a few faculty members in general. So the degree to which any kind of discrimination, I think, is not a fear that is kind of grounded in any reality in the field as the way it's taught or discussed.
I can't speak about modern, political sensibilities and it's sort of at the popular level. I would say I don't see that as a challenge right now in scholarship. In fact, I think I try to make clear in the introduction, what Hrushevsky argued back in his famous article in 1904 was, as long as you have this imperial Russian paradigm over the history, neither the Ukrainians nor the Belarusians nor the Russians could truly write their history, because they were stuck with this, as Talia said, a teleological view of events. And what you're seeing now is people polemicizing. I mean that in the good sense of the word. They're actually confronting the sources. They're citing Hrushevsky, for example, Russian scholars who never cited him before because he was banned from being cited for many years. And so what you're seeing actually is a real dialectic taking place in a very healthy way, as the sort of these icebergs break up and become the separate sort of national views that Hrushevsky had predicted would happen.
I would like to combine two questions that I see here.
Can I just answer that? I wanted to add on to this one. Since it was said anti-Russian bias, one would be, I think, very hard put to find in Hrushevsky and much of this writing, in quotes, anti-Russian bias. He had a vision which said that there was a Ukrainian ethnos or people which had developed over time and that it was different from the development of Russians. This is maybe seen as a national paradigm now, as we would view it, and some historians would question it. Interestingly enough, the issue of Hrushevsky and anti is, I think, more substantively posed on the issue of Poles in Poland. And here we've had some interesting discussions on it by Robert Frost, who has also been a consulting editor of our volumes and has reviewed it. The degree to which Hrushevsky saw Polish influence in the Ukrainian past as largely quite negative. So if the Russian issue is, if one ipso facto says there is no Ukrainian history and there is nothing to study about it, and if you want to view contending with that as being anti-Russian, well, then I guess Hrushevsky is going to be anti-Russian, but I think that would be the limit of where it would go. There might be others who might, what I think is important, and Paul in his introduction points this out, was that Hrushevsky very quickly sees that this Rus is not all one entity and should have been seen in this way long before, that the large territory of it. So I think on those levels, so I don't really see that. On the Polish issue, it is a substantive issue, and it should be discussed. And it involves both Hrushevsky's life and treatment and certain attitudes of both groups as they were forming in the 19th century. Okay, sorry, go on to.
I wanted to combine two questions. One was to discuss the impact of the history on the study of the steppe, and the other was your opinion on Hrushevsky's place in Viking Age studies. So two different studies.
Yeah, so no one, I don't think Hrushevsky does the steppe, and I don't think he could do the steppe in any of the ways that we moderns think about it, because there just is not that conception that these are people to be dealt with as people of their own. It's the sedentarism versus nomadism, I think, divide. So, I mean, I know, Renata was asking that question. Her work on the Kurgans and everything has been seminal in reshaping how we think about these things. David Christian has integrated the steppe into our view of Eurasia. Don Ostrovsky's tried to do the same thing for actually treating the people of the steppe as people, not just as agents of chaos in Rus and later Russian and Ukrainian history. So he doesn't really do that in any way that would be similar enough to us as moderns.
But nonetheless, at least volume 2, as I recall, does have a substantive chapter on the steppe. So even if this field of steppe studies and of, as you say, nomadism and environmental history and looking at the steppe is also, the effect of the environment on people's movements. There's all sorts of really interesting work now on also like DNA studies, etc. Even if this was at its, very infancy, the steppe as a field of study, I think it's still significant that there is a chapter thinking about the steppe as a separate cultural environmental sphere within the larger framework of the story that Hrushevsky is telling. In terms of the Viking question is an interesting one. I don't know if people have found in their courses that Hrushevsky is cited. I would say just in the survey classes that I've done, working with existing Anglophone literature, he hasn't been cited as much as he could be, but also the sort of archaeological finds as well, in terms of the early settlement of the Rus and who they were and so on. Much data in terms of archaeology and so forth was not available to Hrushevsky at the time that he was living and writing.
Just as a footnote on what Talia said about the steppe, in his review of Simon Franklin, Jonathan Shepard's otherwise great book on the origins of Rus culture and the state, Don Ostrovsky points out that they don't mention any Ukrainian historian in their work. They don't cite him, and he says, had they actually read Hrushevsky, Don says, they would have factored in the steppe and Eurasian aspect into the sort of the mixing pot, or whatever you want to call it, the ingredients that made the East Slavic stew in the pre-Mongol period, and not having availed themselves of Hrushevsky and other Ukrainian historians, they missed out on that aspect of what made Rus culture so special.
Now we have more questions coming up now.
I can say the short one here. How long will it take for Hrushevsky to be absorbed and processed by the current generation of Russian and Eastern European scholars?
We had it already.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We all had it already.
Oh, yes.
Now, as thanks to the miracle of Zoom, we have a guest from Brazil who says that it is an important and excellent project that will allow Slavists outside of the global north, such as here in Brazil, to know more about the history and historiography on Rus. I have more of a curiosity. What is Hrushevsky's approach to history and or historicity of the Kyivan Church in his book? And congratulations again. Does anybody have a comment about Hrushevsky's treatment of the church maybe in this?
Leandro, you're always asking about the church. Every time you ask me, I always say I don't do anything with it, but I'm starting to now. I'm starting to try and pay attention to these things. So no, Hrushevsky does though, of course, and he gets into the details of what's going on with the church. And in fact, down to the level of trying to do diocesan structures and things like that, because at the end of each book, okay, that's maybe too general, but there are chapters about each individual area. And he gets into where there were churches, where the churches, to whom were the churches subordinate, that sort of thing. So he does get into that level of detail.
Yeah, I would say that he comes out of sort of a positivist school. He was concerned mainly with getting the facts right and in the right order and telling the story. He was trying to map Ukrainian culture on Ukrainian territory. So his analysis of the church is it's heavily descriptive and not that analytical. Incredibly useful at the time and still very useful. But it's not a great example of social history if that's what the questions that you're getting at.
And I would just add, I think it's in some ways we've talked about earlier in this discussion, the scholarship in some ways coming back to Hrushevsky and the sources and rereading some of the history for this discussion. He does deal with, yes, a more institutional approach to history, but also considered some questions that people are coming back to. For example, the role of Varangian or Eastern Viking contacts in terms of shaping early Rus Christianity pre-Byzantium. We're looking at other ties with Hungary, for example, and material culture even, and mosaics, as we saw that beautiful example earlier. So he does try to present, using the state of the field such as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, different aspects, art historical also of church history, institutional primarily, but also in terms of even, I think we can say, networks and context, even if these ideas are not as developed fully, such as the field has become now.
We have a longer question. I would like to bring it back to Chris Wickham. First, could I ask Paul and Christian to say more on what they on where they depart in their assessment of Chris Wickham's work? He's a major figure in late Roman and early medieval studies. To my knowledge, he does not cite Hrushevsky, but I am interested in any resonances between his work and Hrushevsky's, especially since the dominant contemporary of Hrushevsky in classics and late Roman studies is Mykhailos Rostovtsev, who is significantly more famous and influential, but opposed in his assessment of Kyivan Rus in Ukraine.
So Paul, how about I talk about framing the early Middle Ages and then you talk about medieval Europe? Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
All right. Okay. So framing the early Middle Ages is one of his big seminal books, Wickham's, and it is, I mean, it's a chunk. And he sets up a really nice paradigm of we need to care more about a larger medieval world. And it's really important to include everywhere. And, but I'm not going to include Eastern Europe because they don't read any of the relevant languages. And so I couldn't do it justice. A few pages later, you know, Islam is super important and we really need to include Islam. I don't speak any of the relevant languages, but the translations are very good. And so I'm going to use that to include Islam. And so the picture presented in framing the early Middle Ages is the medieval West and the Mediterranean, which is, you know, so hot right now, right? Medievalists are all about the Mediterranean. But once again, he's created this broad-based idea of let's build a bigger world, but leaves out Eastern Europe. And so that's one of the problems that I have with his work, that has become so foundational. I mean, you read so much, or I read so much medieval scholarship, and framing the early Middle Ages is cited almost everywhere.
Yeah, my citing of Chris Wickham was not to hold up Chris Wickham as a paradigm of scholarship, but rather to say that what Chris Wickham does, particularly in his other books, Medieval Europe, as opposed to the early part, is he tries to come at Europe from a continent-wide context, in the same way that Chris is trying to come at medieval Rus from a continent-wide context. Like, what are all the possible influences? What are all the possible ties? One of the great examples that Tania mentioned it already. One of the great things coming out of Chris's sort of prosopography and networking studies is to show just how widely integrated Rus was with Europe all the way to England. I mean, this is not just neighbors next door. This is all across the continent. So when Wickham, for example, devotes an entire chapter in medieval Europe to the economic boom that happened in the 12th and 13th centuries, he reaffirms the work of Thomas Noonan and others that said that the 12th century in medieval Rus history was not this time of decline and of warring princes killing each other, and with that came economic decline and dissolution. Rather, it was part of Europe and going through the same gigantic economic boom that the rest of Europe was. And so my point of that was just that Rus studies is now seen as part of European studies, whereas, up until, in fact, when I started studying it, it was seen as this kind of quaint little niche boutique industry off to the side that maybe you grafted on like a barnacle onto the hull of Byzantium, but it wasn't really part of Europe and almost not really worthy in and of itself worth studying, except as related to something else. That's not the case today. And I think Wickham does mention Rus in his books. He doesn't cite Hrushevsky, no. He doesn't venture out even much to Poland and much less Ukraine.
Now we are getting to the end. Yes.
I wonder, Talia, could you talk a little bit about your research? I really find it very fascinating. I know that our attendees will find it fascinating as well.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. And I think this is a nice kind of context to do so as well, because I'm a product of Toronto. I did my PhD there, so I have some networks there, as it were. And also Professor Raffensperger was my external examiner at my PhD defense. So it's a nice circle. And certainly I grew up with Hrushevsky Volume 1. So it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm also interested in these connections with medieval Europe, and particularly looking at the very micro studies of women's experiences. So I'm interested in church history, in cultural history, and also in the history of women and how they experience some of these connections and cultural changes through looking at Rus sources, but also primarily I work in Latin. So I'm interested in using Latin documents such as charters or legal documents that these women issued, sometimes signed, as Anna Jaroslavna, the wife of Henry I of France, did, or that they were ruling together with their husbands or their sons sometimes while their sons were young children. So at the moment, I'm starting a new project at the Rylands Library, which is a major manuscript library in the northwest of England in Manchester, looking at case studies of Rus women who married out into some of these places that Paul and Christian have described, Hungary and Poland, but also further afield, France. So I'm very much interested in these connections and in sort of building on Professor Raffensperger's work, illustrating Rus as part of this larger picture of medieval Europe. And at the same time, sort of a connected project to this is on the Trier Psalter, which is on the cover of Volume 3. So as part of exploring the impact on material culture that some of these brides have left, one very rich source that's described by Hrushevsky is the so-called Trier Psalter, or Egbert Psalter, it's sometimes called, which was a 10th century Psalter, a book of Psalms, with additional manuscript folio or pages of prayers written in Latin by a Polish princess, Gertruda, who married a son of Yaroslav Wise, Izyaslav, and so she was also the sister-in-law of Anna Jaroslavna. So I'm currently translating these texts and providing a commentary on some of also the art that accompanies them. So I hope to use some of the manuscripts at the Rylands to put this in kind of also a larger European context. And so having a work like Hrushevsky with all of the great editorial work is invaluable in terms of continuing the scholarly discussion and continuing research on this topic.
Well, I can say that Chris offered quite a bit of depth in our attempts to sort of figure out who all the dynasts are, who they were married to, who their relatives were, and all of the interminglings. It really was quite a task for Chris in this volume as well.
Now, we do still have a few questions, but we are at the end of our allotted time. So I leave it to Frank to make a decision whether we continue or we will sort of wrap it up slowly.
Well, do you have a few questions you'd like to still pose, or should we wrap up at this point? I am about.
Well, how about this?
I have a question. I have a question I can ask about the fact that in volume 2, Hrushevsky writes about the first Ukrainian revolution. And I wonder if somebody could describe a little bit about that first Ukrainian revolution, in as much as today the question of Ukrainian revolution is so relevant. And I don't think that people understand sort of how history repeats itself, how the sort of the long stretch of time, how we go back.
Actually, if none of you wants to jump in, I could say a few words, but please, you're first in line.
Oh, Marko, go ahead, please.
Oh, okay. So what Tania is referring to is the year 1068, and it is when the people of Kyiv, dissatisfied with Izyaslav Yaroslavich for certain reasons, rise up and actually force the prince to flee to Poland. And they release Mstisław Bryaczysławicz, a prince of a different dynastic line, from prison, and establish themselves in Kyiv, and actually manage for a considerable number of time to hold that status quo until Izyaslav comes back with the Polish army and overrides them. And what I found fascinating, and please correct me if I am wrong, I believe that Hrushevsky, who was writing at the end of the 19th century, was the first historian ever to call this revolution, and of course the first one to call it a Ukrainian revolution. And then he actually, if you look through his history of Ukraine-Rus, you will find that he, as a populist historian, is very much attached to these popular movements. He talks about, in volume 2, about 1113, another revolution, and then especially during the Cossack times and so on. And I found it very fascinating that he writes it at the end of the 19th century, not knowing yet how important revolutions, popular revolutions, will be in the history of Ukraine in the formation of the new Ukrainian state, that he himself will be the center of the revolution, Ukraine Revolution 1917. And that's, in 21st century, the revolutions will decide where Ukraine is going. And it is, to me, it is a very, very apt fact that during the 2014 Maidan revolution, the now very famous cartoonist Yuri Zhurovel drew among his main figures Hrushevsky, Professor Hrushevsky, carrying two tires for the barricades. That he was the spirit behind Maidan of 2014. So that's, I'm sorry.
There is in fact a development of Hrushevsky's views on revolution. This also becomes involved after 1905, obviously, as the word revolution comes, and after 1917-21. And of course, one of his most famous and I think most difficult statements on revolution is when he later calls in his later volumes, 1648-49, the greatest revolution which the Ukrainian people had ever lived under. Of course, this was done after 1917-18, and he was writing in the 1920s in the Soviet Union. So obviously the positives and negatives of revolution. And of course, we've had considerable discussion of his attempt to look at masses and be on the side of the masses about the molecular princes. I think perhaps at this point, we have whetted our audience's interest into looking at these earlier volumes. We hope that they will continue on into pursuing this into the later volumes, as we will run a number of events dealing with this. When we look at Hrushevsky sat and decided to write the history of the Ukrainian people. In practice, to what degree it is the people and to what degree it is the political entities that were on Ukraine and what degree is society, all has to be looked in a complex way. Above all, as a number of our speakers have pointed out, he was a positivist and believed in sources. And so however one may look at Hrushevsky's perspectives, one can find a tremendous amount of material in it. In a way, we set out on a scholarly venture that, to be quite honest, also had political ramifications. Just as Hrushevsky was to write and in many ways demonstrate that there was a Ukrainian history and therefore a Ukrainian people and therefore Ukraine as an entity, to a great degree, the goal of the Hrushevsky translation project was to make a great historian available to a wider circle, but also one that affirmed a certain Ukrainian national paradigm or course of development of its history, at least to show what a major scholar, true to his sources, although often having very strong views, wrote about these periods. And in particular, to show the value of these earlier volumes, which I think our speakers today pointed out, have not always been paid attention to, both because of the linguistic issue, and I would argue at times, sometimes cultural biases of this. We have been very fortunate for the Hrushevsky translation project that we've been able to involve so many scholars in the field. And I'm particularly grateful that we had 3 such prominent scholars of Rus with us today, who have looked at Hrushevsky's Rus-Ukraine volumes, who've given us their evaluation as well as an evaluation of the project. I'm grateful to them. I'm grateful to those who listened and took part in this discussion. And I am as well grateful to the many supporters of our project. We will, as I have said, this will not be, this is the beginning of our Hrushevsky year. We will be having a number of launches dealing with both this volume, but as well as discussing the other volumes and the many, many people, other people who have given and worked on this project. And then we will be aiming at those students, at that next generation, as finding ways to get these volumes out. There is a tendency in much of academia for history to be shrunk to almost post-World War II history or 20th century history and not much before it. That has never been the goal of the institutes and institutions I've been associated with. I think we had pointed out very well by Paul that the investment in Harvard and medieval studies that attracted so many people to the medieval and early modern period who dealt with the Slavic world was really quite a good one in the persons of Professor Shevchenko and Pritsak. We certainly in Edmonton, particularly when Serhiy Plokhy was with us and Zen and Kohut had an early modern focus. We are going to continue, obviously, our attention in the Zajac Center is the center for the study of the entirety of Ukrainian history, and we'll have a number of projects. We're now particularly specializing on the 18th and to some degree the 19th century, but we will not abandon the medieval and early modern period, and we look on all of those participating today to help us with this. So with that, I would like to suggest that the books are available. We must admit they eventually will get online, but you can see there are beautiful, beautiful books well worth having, and we hope many of you will avail yourself of the opportunity of purchasing them. Thank you very much for taking part in this.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
For having us.
Thank you. Thank you.